If you're watching this channel, it's because you don't enjoy watching the world squander what Christendom built, but you want to do your part. And chances are you've heard me mention a great means by doing just that. Email made by and for Catholics. Check out fidei.email. That's FIDEI.email. Built for Catholic individuals, families, organizations, and groups. They're private, secure, and of course, they're Catholic. And they're offering 2 months off on your first year for an annual subscription if you enter the coupon code Return to Tradition without spaces. That's the name of this channel, without spaces, at checkout.
The winds of change are in the air. Francis has been making some changes to rules and to announcements about other things that he could change the rules on if he wanted to, that some would certainly use as a sign, as evidence, that he knows his time is short and that there will be another conclave soon. And in the grand scheme of things, there probably will be another conclave fairly soon. I do stand by my prediction that Francis will be around for a lot longer than most people tend to think. As evidence of this, as I spoke about Saturday, he has planned a trip to Southeast Asia for the fall, just before the next phase of the Synod on Synodality kicks off in October. Francis is making medium-term plans. You don't typically do that if you don't think you're going to be around for very much longer. But Francis, despite all that, has issued a couple of statements that are worth going over here. Their signs are that Francis's papacy, or his alleged papacy, is coming to an end in the not terribly distant future, as evidenced by 2 stories I have for you today. Both are from katholisch.de, which is the official news arm of the German Bishops' Conference. Yes, those same German bishops who want to rethink Catholicism and use Vatican II and synodality to completely remake the church. Those same bishops. But this is their official news arm, so this is coming from a relatively trustworthy source that's not going to try to distort the news coming from Rome. The first story of these comes with this headline: No more public laying outs for dead popes. For centuries, the burial of a pope has been one of the most elaborate rituals of the Catholic Church. For his own passing, however, Francis has already made arrangements to simplify things. All right, so do you remember the scandal of Benedict XVI's funeral? As you'll recall, he wasn't given the traditional funeral mass that he likely would have wanted. He was, in a lot of ways, treated like almost with disdain when they did show him publicly. It was much more stripped down of a ceremony than we had seen with John Paul II or with John Paul I or Paul VI or any of the others that you may have been around to witness. It was the most subdued papal funeral that anybody had probably ever seen, and probably going back to a very long ways in church history. Some took that as a personal slight against Benedict, and certainly that may have been one of the motivations for Francis in treating Benedict this way. But this story illustrates something here, and it's perfectly in keeping with Francis's rhetoric about the church needing to be a church for the poor, not having a lot of external signs of wealth and ostentatious things and unnecessary gold-gilded things and those sorts of things. What we're about to hear is that Francis is downplaying the significance of the papacy itself in a further act of what gets called collegiality. They're never going to tell you that, but that's what they're telling us. At Vatican II, some bishops called for the Eastern Orthodox view of the papacy essentially to be foisted upon the church. Now, the Bishop of Rome was basically reduced to being first among equals, and not really much more than that. Paul VI thankfully put a stop to that nonsense, but just barely. Francis is helping inch such things along with what he's doing here. So here's the entire article from Katholisch. It's extremely short. It's shorter than things I quote for you often. So, quote, in the Vatican, the ritual for the burial of popes is being greatly simplified. Pope Francis announced this in an interview book with the Spanish journalist Javier Martinez Brocal, which will be published on Wednesday. According to the book, the deceased pope will no longer be laid out in St. Peter's Basilica for the last salute of the faithful. Benedict XVI was the last pope to be laid out on a catafalque outside the coffin. Francis explained in the interview. He had already spoken to the Master of Ceremonies and had canceled this and many other things in the papal funeral ritual. In the future, popes should be buried, quote, like any other child of the church, said Francis, adding, with dignity but not on pillows. The previous funeral ritual had been overloaded. In the future, there will be no longer a separate rite for closing the coffin. For himself, he would like his body to be transferred to the Church of Santa Maria Maggiore immediately after the Vatican funeral." End quote. If we get a decent pope after Francis, that will almost certainly be done away with. But this story is along the lines that I had been predicting, that we'd get some kind of announcement about rules for the conclave, since every pope seems to adjust the rules for the next conclave as they see fit. Touching the funeral process for a pope is absolutely among those things. But also, we did get an announcement from Francis about a conclave. Conclave is the process where the cardinals come after the see has been made vacant, where they come together and they choose, typically from amongst themselves, who the next pontiff will be. Francis has announced that he doesn't want to change the rules for it at all, which is weird. Honestly, I had predicted that he was going to make it more synodal. We had gotten a lot of reports on that, which it touches on in this article. But he says he doesn't want to change the rules for it. And of all the things he's doing, this is the one thing I could see him still changing his mind on in the future, depending on how a lot of other things go. Depending on if Fiducia Supplicans eventually does fade into the background, depending on how many more consistories he can have, where he can keep replacing cardinals and making more cardinals of his liking. This is the kind of rule that he could change. He says he's not interested in changing it now. Just remember, popes typically change the rules of the conclave as they see fit. It's something virtually all of them do. Benedict undid rule changes done by John Paul II, rule changes that he probably helped John Paul II make. John Paul II changed them from how John Paul I had them. John Paul I hadn't had the time to change them. They're the same rules that that Paul VI implemented, but Paul VI changed them as well. They always change them to some degree. I would be surprised if Francis didn't tinker with the rules before his time is up. But Francis has in fact announced he doesn't want to change the rules at all. So here's the rule headline from Catholic. Pope Francis does not want to change conclave norms. There has been repeated speculation recently as to whether Pope Francis would change the rules for the papal election. However, the pontiff has rejected a fundamental conclave reform. He considers it too important. They never tell you what that fundamental conclave reform is. They never tell you it in this article. But that had been a rumor that a cardinal whose name you'll hear in this short excerpt, the article will tell you that cardinal brought him a fundamental reform, and that is the same cardinal who many of us reported back last summer that approached Francis with a proposal to include laity in the process of choosing the next pontiff, either in the form of them being advisors at the conclave to remind the cardinals to essentially give them another Bergoglian, because these would be handpicked, or as voting members of the conclave. It would be the most radical change to the papacy selection process since probably the 10th century or so. Here's the article, quote, Pope Francis is not planning any fundamental changes to the current norms for the election of his successor. In the Spanish interview book El Sucesor, which will be published on Wednesday, the Pope said, "There is nothing to it. Some media have speculated about changes." Francis continued, "I have not changed anything because the matter seems secondary to me. The mechanism worked very well in the past 2 conclaves I attended. Perhaps it would make sense to change a few things, but they don't seem urgent to me, and I don't need to devote myself to this for the time being." In recent months, conservative internet portals had surmised that Francis was working on a reform of the conclave rules together with the canon lawyer Cardinal Gianfranco Ghirlanda. Most recently, an unidentified cardinal wrote a text under the pseudonym Demos II, in which he demanded that a future pope should not be an autocrat but should be advised by his College of Cardinals. In February, church historian Alberto Maloney called for a change to the electoral rules for popes. In view of fake news offensives, precautions must be taken so that the cardinals are not tempted to elect a worse candidate as pope due to possible accusations against the candidate. End quote. Of all these things, I do think the conclave rules are the ones most likely to be subject to change, given that I think Francis will be around a lot longer than anyone thinks, and because he gave a qualifying statement for what he means, for what the importance he thinks of this. He says he thinks they're secondary. If indications change on that is no longer secondary, but that there's a very real threat that he will be followed by somebody he doesn't like who will undo his legacy, then he may go ahead and change the rules at that time. Again, I'd have that unpopular position of thinking Francis will be around, that this time next year we'll be talking about Francis, and there will be all the articles ad nauseum about him possibly resigning or that he's in his final days and all this stuff, and that maybe 2 years from now we'll still be talking about him. That's my suspicion, that he'll be around for a while yet longer than anybody thinks. I could be wrong about that, though. But I'm curious, are you surprised that he's not changing the rules for the conclave? Are you surprised or saddened that he's trying to permanently change how popes are treated in their funerals? Do you see it as an attempt to knock down a lot of the esteem for the papacy? I know many of you won't be saddened by that for Francis himself, but future pontiffs. This is a question I think worth discussing. So let me know in the comments, please. You like and subscribe if you haven't, it does help. So to sharing this on social media, that helps too. And if for those of you who have asked where the link to the Give, Send, Go campaign is that a viewer started for me after the news I broke on Easter, on a personal front, it's in the pinned comment. As always, pray for the church. I'm Anthony Stine. Ave Maria.